Hello everyone and welcome back to another video of mine. It's been a long time. No, I did not take any of the hate from my last video to heart. I still stand by what I said. Anyways, more controversial takes, but this time it will be more of a yapping session. Talking about why so many of the 3.x characters failed to become relevant and why they were so hyped originally. So I'll go over the different archetypes of Dendro and explain why most of them failed and what could potentially save them in the future. Then I will draw my conclusion. Disclaimer as always, this is just purely based on my experience and cheats I've done, as well as some other people that I've asked. So if you have any problems with any of the points I make, please leave a respectful comment explaining your perspective on the matter instead. Thank you. So let's start with the easiest one to understand. Quicken. So since these are two separate reactions to focus on, aggravate and spread, I'll also differentiate them while discussing their flaws because they actually do fail in a different way. So how does aggravate work? When Dendro and Electro are reacting together, they create a quicken aura, similar to the freeze aura. Whenever Electro is applied to the enemy then will take a flat amount of extra damage, which is then increased by the amount of damage percent and crit the attacking unit has, or if there's any death shred or resistance shred on the enemy, that will also be taken into account. So basically you do more damage the more you apply Electro. Meaning when we want to build around this archetype, we are looking for units that apply a lot of Electro. The elephant in the room here would obviously be Fischl. Her high amount of Electro application from her field is extremely relevant for this archetype. She has a passive that allows her to do an additional attack if there's an Electro reaction happening on the field. This initial damage on it isn't very good, but since it has no ICD, it's just a lot of free aggravates. Fischl also gets to abuse the Golden Troop set, meaning she gets a ton of damage percent for free. She has a bunch of really good weapon options. She seems like the perfect unit for this archetype. Or is she? In a vacuum, she may be, however there are some issues with the synergies. Nahida, the premier off-field Dendro applier for the Electro archetype, has a big buff that only works for the on-fielder. And Fischl can snapshot the EM, but can snapshot Kazu's damage percent. The first leads to less damage obviously, but the second leads to a clunky rotation. Fischl also usually forces the team into 25-second rotations, or rather one 12-second, one 13-second rotation when maximizing her damage. However, you can do 15-second rotations as well. She does lose damage if you do that though. It just doesn't feel as clean as someone like Emily. Lastly, her ceiling is reached extremely easily. There's no cons you can pull on her to make her sub DPS stronger, like for Emily for example, pulling her signature or her constellations. This is mostly a reason for her falling off for Dolphin or Whale investment. So who else do we have that causes a lot of problems in this archetype? It's the Relish girl, the Dendro Archon herself of course. At a baseline, she's just there to apply Dendro and give a relatively large EM buff to the on-fielder. However, when comparing her damage to other off-field sub-DPS units that apply their own element, it's pretty underwhelming, even though she literally gets free spreads on every single hit. She does actually have AoE up to 8 targets, so it will feel like she's doing more in AoE situations. But it's just never worth it to go for her signature or really go hard on her artifacts. It's just still not enough to really justify. Nahida is also known for her multi-wave issues, which wouldn't be a big issue when playing a flexible unit like Miko, but when maximizing damage, meaning playing Clorant of course, it does become a problem when you clear a wave too fast and now you waste your entire Clorant uptime swapping into Nahida to reapply Dendro. A similar problem with Kazu, even though he actually does do great off-field sub-DPS in AoE, the cooldowns don't entirely line up, meaning you usually burst once in that 25-second rotation, and VV also has multi-wave issues, so sometimes you would be better off playing Shilonen, who's a healer at least, so she's nice for the team I guess, but you're still using Kazua's sub DPS. Then we have the actual on-fielders in the Aggravate archetype, and well, Clorant is good, but outside of her high application there's no real synergy with the team. As a hyper carry, she even anti-synergizes with the idea of playing another sub DPS to carry her damage. That's why you shouldn't really play Aggravate if you pull her cons or her weapon. I think Zathos is an actual interesting unit for that role, and no one really talked about him after his release. His Pierce AoE is actually pretty good and he does have alright scalings. He even synergizes with the M, unlike Laurent. His cons are also very impactful, but no one really has them. But he's still like nothing insane. His damage window is flexible, similar to Arlecchino, meaning he can switch out and buffs can be reapplied without harsh cooldown punishment. So that's an upside. So next is Yaimiko, and well, she used to be the peak of the team, but she kinda just fell off. First of all, her damage is almost entirely single target. You are supposed to on-field her in single target, but she has very low scalings on her basics, and while the charge attack is pretty alright, even has 2 hits technically when facing enemies with larger hitboxes that can both aggravate. They cost 50 stamina, which is just way too high for a low defense character that doesn't gain any resistance to interruption or iframes during her window. You need the stamina for dashing, otherwise you will just die. I think her burst was always quite underrated, especially with Ritziv. You could line the buff up when you were using her burst. Also because of Fischl's good particle generation, you get to burst every rotation. All buffs would be good since it's a 4-hit attack that can aggravate 4 times, and a large 2271% attack motion value when crowned, not to mention relatively large AoE. I'm so tired of people pretending her burst is bad. I think the skill is actually the main issue. The standard ICD hurts very much, and her random targeting might allow for multiple aggravates in a row. I don't think it helps enough though. Outside of her A4 there's zero self-buffing, so while she does have a pretty good kit, her damage ends up pretty low for the on-fielder of the team. As a strict off-fielder I think she's better, but she's competing with Fischl in Aggravate Teams, who's hard to beat, and Nahida's burst also isn't there for her Ascension 4 passive. If you pull for her cons, it actually does the same thing as it does for Clorant. She can finally burst outside of Aggravate, and with C2, the attack motion value of her skill is increased, meaning you would rather give her more attack buffs than the flat Aggravate buffs. So in conclusion, she also doesn't really seem like the perfect fit for the team. Keqing is basically just Clorant, except she does fit better into Fischl's rotations, but her damage is way lower. That basically sums it up. She may feel more comfortable to play than Miko because of her higher defensive stats and more iframes. I'm going to ignore Sino for now, but just know that I'll be coming for him too in the Hyperbloom section. So conclusion on the archetype, currently all the units have some synergy problems with each other, and even the theoretical best version, Clorant, Fischl, Nahida and then Gilonen or Kazuha, does not feel like a complete team, especially with Nahida at C0. Now we are going to discuss the better reaction that still forms the worst archetype, that being Spread. Spread inherently just benefits more from the reaction because instead of a 1.15 times multiplier, it has a 1.25 times multiplier. However, that doesn't really save the archetype, sadly. Okay, just a quick educational section. I wanted to talk about the quicken damage formula in general because it also contributes to Dendro feeling underwhelming. As already stated, the flat damage buff is based on level and the EM of the character who applied Dendro or Electro to the quickened aura. So basically the reaction multiplier, which would be 1.25 or 1.15 depending on the reaction, is multiplied by the level multiplier, which is the reason why level 19 characters is so important for this archetype, and again multiplied by 1 plus the EM multiplier and different reaction bonuses, for example Baiju's buff or the TF artifact set. This EM multiplier for the reaction diminishes slightly less harsh compared to the one for amplifying reactions. However, compared to transformative reactions, it's still very noticeable. That just basically means that getting more and more EM past a certain point doesn't actually increase the damage you gain from the reactions by a lot. A big problem, considering how many sources of EM are thrown around in these archetypes, Archetypes can reach 800 EM, for example, very easily. So effectively, let's say a fictional unit has a skill that does 100% of their attack, and when buffed, this unit's attack reaches 3000 for simplification. If that hit can react, even though the hit itself is very small, getting to forward, vape or melt this hit would always be better than aggravating or spreading it. Without any EM, it would actually be better to aggravate or spread the damage instance compared to reverse melting or vaping it. But as soon as we are looking at around 90 EM, getting to aggravate the hit would be worse, and at around 230 EM, using spread would be worse. As soon as we are looking at a bigger hit than 800% of attack, it would always be better to use amplifying reactions instead of additive ones. That's just because the flat damage isn't a lot. An easy explanation for that could also just be there's no real opportunity cost of using quicken reactions, whereas for vape or melt, it will consume the other element in the process, but the only benefit you get for that is that you can effectively have both Electro and Dendro profiting out of the reaction. Also not entirely true regarding vape or melt, since in international, both child and jungling are heavily profiting out of these reactions. But looking at the quicken teams, it is also just not the case, because the units enabling the quicken reaction barely contribute anything to the overall damage of the team. But more on that in the second part of my Dendro team analysis. So now regarding the spread archetype. The biggest problem I see is that first, characters are balanced around already getting spread reactions for their damage. So both Archetypes, Tainari and I guess Nahida all do pathetic damage outside of spread, but not only that, the damage is also balanced around Hyper Bloom, which is the reason why Archetypes' damage, even though he literally gains so many buffs in Quick Bloom, isn't even necessarily the majority of the team's damage in single target, which obviously makes the teams without Hyper Bloom as a form of sub DPS seem extremely underwhelming compared to them. Another problem for spread teams is Fischl actually. She might seem perfect for this at first. She would still do a decent amount of sub DPS and also provide the quicken aura, but the thing is, she doesn't. The way her Ascension 4 works is that it has to be an electro reaction, because you are playing two Dendro units with a lot of Dendro application. The on-fielder is just always going to trigger spread, not quicken, and spread isn't an electro reaction, meaning you don't get Fischl Ascension 4 procs. This significantly reduces the amount of damage you can do overall with Fischl, and since there's no VB in the team either, and Fischl kind of ruins Archetypes' flexible rotations, Fischl is just kind of garbage in spread teams. She can still hold allergy, so I guess that's something. But her AoE isn't great either. So you could technically run into a scenario where not all of the enemies that are in the chamber are actually applied with the quicken aura, which would obviously massively reduce the damage that you are doing. Then there's again Yaemiko, who I think is quite good in spread teams actually. Archetype also doesn't really mind her longer on-field time, since again he's flexible in the rotations. However, then what? There's no good last slot for the team that isn't a Hydro unit, and if you play a Hydro unit, you'd be much better off playing Cookie to get actual consistent Hyper Bloom, since Miko is really bad at triggering those. And you're back to Quick Bloom, which is Archetype's best team at the moment, and has its own issues obviously. Jansson does actually provide a lot of stats for Archetype, but he doesn't move that much, so you probably can't proc her C6 properly, which means you just get a scroll buff and a ton of attack on a unit that doesn't really want attack. It's not like attack is useless, but the way Archetypes scales with stats, he would much rather prefer Farina's damage percent over this. So obviously I would rather recommend going for C2 Farina over going for C6 Janssen just to increase Archetypes damage. And we all know how reliable it is to get C6 Fosters on banners anyway. So in conclusion, pure spread teams aren't developed right now and we are still missing units for it to feel complete. There's a way to kind of cheat with Archetypes spread teams without using Hydro, which would be using him in some kind of quick burn team with Emily and kind of let Emily carry the team, but just by replacing Archetypes with Bennett and on-fielding Emily instead, the team would be better. So that kind of leads us to the next archetype, which is Burning, and funnily enough, it kind of ruined the Dendro teams. I'm joking, but I do think the direction they took is very interesting from a game design point. The earlier Dendro units got punished for using Pyro units in their team, and the newer Dendro units use Pyro units in their team, and without these Pyro units they are like completely cooked. But they also form teams that are just straight up better than the older ones. Emily and Kinnick don't feel like real Dendro units. It's a similar situation to Navia versus Ito. Damage focus units wanting to be played with themselves, but then suddenly Navia released and even has a passive that encourages being played with patch element characters. But enough, yeah. Emily has such a simple yet such a strong kit. She deals a ton of damage from our field, with her only requirement being that the enemy has to be burning and relatively consistently burning. Otherwise, she doesn't really do shit, of course. Her raw damage in most teams is so much more impactful than Nahida's application, buffing and sub DPS together combined could ever be. Yes, I do think Emily is a better unit than Nahida at the moment. There's not really much to say other than she's just kinda really good. Her biggest issue is that Pyro units get the most busted teams ever with the introduction of Sitlali, meaning you will never see her be played with an actual Pyro on-fielder. But with Kinnick, she does actually form an extremely competent team that I would consider to be one of the best in the game. Dare I say, the best non-vape / melt team at C0. It's like still up for debate and Veressa is probably changing that as well. But regarding Kinnick, he's still a very competent unit even without Emily. Don't get me wrong, using Mona, Farina, or even just using Kirara or something. Then Bennett and Toma / Dea with Deepwood in the last slot, and the team will still do more single target damage than any of the Dendro teams that are focused on reactions could ever do. I think people still kinda overrate using Yelano Synchro with him, since they could potentially hinder you from getting your 5th shot, which is very crucial for him to compete. With Janssen, his best team seems to be Deepwood Mavrika with Scroll Janssen, which means that you can actually get both buffs without needing to sacrifice Reverie on Emily. There's also the Bennett Janssen version, but outside of specific scenarios, I don't think it will outperform the other version. And now the other big advantage that Emily and Kinnick have is vertical investment. Both of their early constellations are extremely busted, same with their signatures, and since you could also easily fit in Farina in Kinnick teams, he does take full advantage out of C2 Farina, unlike certain teams with a big portion of the team's damage coming from transformative reaction, which Farina obviously doesn't buff at all. Not to mention access to Mavrika C2, which is a bit underwhelming, but it's still a fine increase. And Mavrika does actual respectable off-field sub-DPS at C2 as well. Meanwhile, any Dendro team that relies on Nahida is completely fucked by both her C1 and R1 being extremely underwhelming. That sums up the first part of my critique regarding Dendro teams. Next will be Bloom, Virgin and Hyper Bloom teams and some of the other scuff teams you can do with Dendro, so stay tuned. If you have any more questions, leave them down below in the comment section. If you like this guide, feel free to like and sub, it would help me out. Have a nice day.